Imagine spending a lazy Saturday finally tackling that garage you have been putting off for months, dragging out dusty boxes, cracked tackle trays, and moldy canvas bags, tossing things into a pile for the dump without a second thought, and never once suspecting that somewhere in that pile sits an object worth almost $1,000. Because that is exactly what happens to people every single year when old fishing reels get pitched simply for looking rusty, grimy, or hopelessly outdated. And the frustrating truth is that most folks have no idea that a handful of small, easy-to-check details can transform a piece of what looks like total garage junk into a genuine collector's prize. So today we are counting down 10 old fishing reels that might be quietly hiding real money in your own house. And fair warning, the reel waiting at number 4 has genuinely caught seasoned collectors off guard. So stick around because you will not want to miss it. And we begin at number 10 with the Pfluger Supreme, a reel that gets tossed aside constantly because its body looks like it has been sitting at the bottom of a lake for a decade, all crusted with orange rust and grime. Yet here is the part almost nobody knows. Many of the earliest Pfluger Supreme reels were built using genuine jeweled bearings, a feature that dedicated collectors are still actively hunting for today. So before you ever throw one in the junk pile, flip it over and take a close look at the reel foot, because if you spot an early patent stamp pressed into that metal, there is a real chance you are holding something worth far more than its rough appearance suggests. And this is not just theory either, because one particular Pfluger Supreme was pulled out of a water-damaged tackle box that looked like it belonged in a landfill, covered in grime and completely seized up. Yet after a patient and careful cleaning session, the jeweled bearings inside still spun smoothly like the day they were made, and that same reel sold online for $940 only a few days later, proving that appearances can be wildly deceiving. And before moving on to the next entry on our list, take one more look at the screws holding the reel together, because if those original flathead screws are still intact rather than replaced with modern hardware, the value of that reel can climb even higher than you might expect. Which brings us to a reel that hides an even bigger surprise than the one before it, because at number 9, most people glance at this next reel, see heavy corrosion covering the metal, and immediately assume it belongs in the scrap pile, which is precisely why so many genuinely valuable examples end up thrown away without a second look. But sometimes the ugliest, crustiest reel sitting at the bottom of the tackle box is hiding the single biggest surprise on this entire list. And that reel is the Ocean City Surf Reel, a heavy-duty saltwater workhorse built to endure punishing ocean conditions that would destroy almost any other piece of fishing gear you can imagine. And while years of salt spray, humidity, and corrosion can make the outside look like a lost cause, what is happening on the inside tells a completely different story. Because many early Ocean City models were fitted with solid brass gears. And those brass components very often survive perfectly intact even when the exterior looks like it has been through a shipwreck. And one family discovered exactly this while clearing out an old backyard shed, ready to toss everything into a dumpster, when somebody spotted a forgotten Ocean City reel wedged behind a dusty can of old paint, its handle completely frozen in place, and its frame coated in thick white salt stains that made it look totally dead. But after a slow and gentle cleaning process, those brass gears sprang back to life exactly as they had been built to do decades earlier, and it turned out to be an early number 61 model, which a collector happily purchased for $680. So remember, if you ever come across an old saltwater reel like this, never force a stuck handle, because forcing it can crack components that a little patience and soaking would have saved, so let it soak first. Inspect the frame carefully for any hairline cracks, and check the model number stamped on the side plate, because those small details can make an enormous difference in what a reel is actually worth. And if you found that surprising, wait until you hear about the next reel, because it managed to fool collectors for years simply because almost everyone mistook it for nothing more than a cheap plastic toy. And that brings us to number 8, because if you have ever walked right past a small, unassuming fishing reel because it looked too cheap and flimsy to matter, You may have made a costly mistake without even realizing it. And this next entry proves beyond any doubt that size means absolutely nothing once serious collectors start bidding against each other. And that reel is the Shakespeare Wonder Reel, which spent decades being underestimated for one simple reason. Its nose cone looked like ordinary painted plastic. And that single wrong assumption has caused countless genuinely valuable reels to be completely ignored at garage sales, flea markets, and estate auctions across the country. But here is what most people never bothered to discover. Many of the earliest Wonder reels were actually built with a solid metal nose cone hidden beneath that painted finish, making those particular early versions far more desirable than the later plastic ones that came afterward. And one buyer very nearly walked right past a dusty crate stuffed full of old reels, until a faded, worn-out original box happened to catch his eye at just the right moment. And inside that box sat a Wonder reel that every other shopper at the sale had completely dismissed without a second glance. And just a few days later, that same overlooked reel sold for $550, while the rest of the crate barely fetched a few dollars total. So remember, never judge one of these reels purely by its appearance. Instead, gently tap the nose cone and listen closely, because a solid metallic sound is exactly what serious collectors are hopping to hear. And then check for the original box or an instruction sheet, since even a worn, yellowed piece of paperwork can meaningfully increase the final value. And do not get too comfortable yet, because the next reel on our list is one that practically every American family has owned at some point. Yet only a small handful of specific versions are actually worth serious money today. And that brings us to number 7, and the Zebco 33. A reel so universally recognized that this very familiarity is exactly why so many valuable examples get accidentally sold off for just a few dollars at yard sales. Because while millions upon millions of these reels were manufactured over the decades, not every single Zebco 33 out there is created equal, and the version that serious collectors are quietly hunting down happens to be the early models manufactured in Tulsa, Oklahoma, long before the company shifted its production elsewhere. And at first glance, this reel looks exactly like every other Zebco 33 you have ever seen sitting in a tackle box. But there is one small detail that can completely transform its value, and during one particular garage cleanout. An old dented coffee can stuffed full of dusty fishing reels was headed straight for the donation pile without any hesitation. And while most of those reels were completely ordinary, one of them had a solid metal foot instead of the usual plastic foot that everyone expected to see. And that tiny, easy-to-miss difference was enough to make somebody stop and look a little closer. And a quick inspection revealed the Tulsa stamp hidden on the housing, confirming it was one of those early American-made models everyone was searching for. And instead of quietly ending up on a thrift store shelf for a couple of dollars, that reel eventually sold to an eager collector for $240. So if you ever come across a Zebco 33 in your own house, do not automatically assume it is common and worthless. Turn it over first and inspect the foot, since metal is always far more desirable than plastic. And then look carefully for a manufacturing stamp somewhere on the housing, because that is exactly where the real story of the reel begins. And do not miss what comes next either, because the following reel on our list is a saltwater giant that looked completely ruined at first glance, until one single hidden feature turned it into a genuine $700 surprise. And that brings us to number 6, because some fishing reels were designed simply to catch fish. While this particular reel was engineered to survive brutal, ongoing battles against the raw power of the open ocean, and that reputation is exactly why so many people instinctively assume that an old, heavily rusted pen senator is completely beyond saving the moment they spot one. But what looks like nothing more than scrap metal to an untrained eye can look like a genuinely hidden treasure to someone who actually knows what they are looking at. And that reel is the legendary pen senator, a workhorse trusted by deep-sea anglers across multiple generations of hardcore saltwater fishing. And even after spending decades locked away inside salty, humid boat lockers, Many of the early Penn Senator models still hide one feature that makes them extremely collectible today, namely their rugged bronze gear housing, because while cheaper, lower quality reels corrode far beyond any hope of repair. These particular reels were engineered from the very beginning to endure exactly that kind of punishment, and one boat auction very nearly ended with an entire crate of old, forgotten reels being sold off as worthless scrap metal for just a handful of dollars, until one sharp-eyed collector noticed something that everyone else in the room had completely missed: an early two-piece Penn Senator housing buried near the bottom of the pile, and after a careful, patient restoration process, that once-forgotten reel sold for $710, instantly turning what looked like scrap into an incredible, unexpected payday. So if you ever come across a Penn Senator sitting in an old tackle box, never force a frozen handle right away, because old hardened grease is very often the real culprit rather than any actual broken gears underneath. So next, inspect the housing carefully, since those early two-piece versions are considerably more desirable than the later one-piece designs that eventually replaced them. And an original knurled drag knob can add even more value on top of that. But do not leave just yet, because the next reel on our list managed to fool generations of anglers into believing it was nothing more than a cheap beginner's toy. And that costly assumption has ended up costing unsuspecting sellers hundreds of dollars over the years. Which brings us to number 5, because have you ever picked up an old plastic fishing reel and immediately thought there is absolutely no way this cheap-looking thing could be worth anything at all? That exact assumption is shared by thousands of people, and it happens to be the reason why one of the single biggest hidden bargains on this entire list keeps slipping right through people's fingers without them ever realizing it. And that reel is the Johnson Century Spincast. A reel that spent decades quietly attached to countless beginner fishing rods, handed down to children learning to fish for the very first time. And because of that humble reputation, most people never even bother giving it a second glance when they spot one. But the very earliest models of this reel tell a completely different story than the later ones, because before the manufacturer eventually switched over to cheaper plastic components, the first Johnson Century reels were actually built using a solid metal nose cone, and that particular early version happens to be exactly what serious, dedicated collectors are always hoping to stumble across. And at one crowded estate sale, an entire dusty box of old fishing gear was priced so low that most shoppers barely even paused long enough to look inside it properly. Until one sharp-eyed collector noticed an early script-style logo along with a shiny metal nose cone hidden underneath years of accumulated dirt and grime, and that completely overlooked reel later sold for $380, proving once again that snap first impressions can end up being remarkably expensive mistakes. So if you ever discover a Johnson Century reel of your own, check that nose cone before anything else, because metal beats plastic every single time in this particular case. And then take a close look at the logo itself, since that early script-style lettering is considerably harder to come by today than the later block letter versions that eventually replaced it. And do not miss the reel waiting at number 4, because it happens to be so genuinely rare that even experienced, seasoned collectors get visibly excited the very moment they recognize its name. And that brings us to number 4, because most people out there have honestly never even heard of this next reel. And that lack of recognition is precisely what makes it so incredibly valuable in the first place. Because while collectors actively fight over more famous, well-known brand names, this particular forgotten reel quietly slips through garage sales, flea markets, and estate auctions completely unnoticed time and time again. And that reel is the Bronson Fisherman, a Depression-era bait-casting reel that was produced in far smaller numbers than its better-known competitors from that same era. And because the Bronson name simply is not as instantly recognizable as bigger names like Shakespeare or Penn, many unsuspecting owners assume it is nothing more than just another outdated, worthless reel with little to no real value attached to it. And that costly assumption has made surviving examples of this particular reel incredibly hard to track down today. And one woman sorting carefully through her late father's old tackle box very nearly donated this exact reel without giving it a second thought. But hidden beneath a pile of completely ordinary reels sat a dusty Bronson fisherman wrapped carefully inside an old cloth. And a local collector immediately recognized the name the moment he saw it, carefully inspected the internal gears, and confirmed on the spot that it was a genuinely complete early model. And just days later, that same forgotten reel sold for $890. So if you ever happen to come across one yourself, do not focus on the surface rust first. Instead, look specifically for the Bronson stamp. Then check carefully whether the original gear train is still fully complete inside. And finally, inspect the handle knobs closely, since original wooden knobs are considerably more desirable than the later plastic replacements that eventually became standard. And if you found that particular hidden gem impressive, just wait until you see what is coming at number 3, a reel that millions of everyday anglers once owned. Yet only a small handful of specific versions are actually worth any real collector money today. And that brings us to number 3, because here is something that genuinely surprises almost every single collector out there. This next reel was once so incredibly common that people practically gave it away for free without thinking twice. And that overwhelming abundance is exactly why the handful of genuinely valuable versions still hiding quietly in old tackle boxes get overlooked constantly, day after day. And that reel is the Garcia Mitchell 300, one of the most famous and widely recognized spinning reels ever manufactured. And while millions of these reels were sold across multiple decades, do not let that massive number fool you, because the earliest French-made models exist in a completely different league of their own, and dedicated collectors will very often pay significantly more money for those particular early versions than they ever would for the later ones that came afterward. And at one quiet neighborhood garage sale, a dusty old Mitchell 300 sat inside a cardboard box marked with a simple $2 price tag. And dozens of shoppers walked right past it without giving it so much as a second glance, until one observant buyer noticed 4 simple words stamped directly onto the housing, reading "Made in France." And that single tiny detail changed absolutely everything about the situation, because after its authenticity was carefully confirmed by an expert, that same reel eventually sold for $320, all because one person happened to know exactly what small detail to look for. So if you ever find a Garcia Mitchell 300 of your own, start by checking that housing stamp first, since French-made models are precisely the ones that serious collectors are actively chasing. Next, test the bail arm carefully to make sure it still moves smoothly without sticking. And then inspect the original ribbed spool closely, since any later replacement spool can meaningfully reduce the reel's overall value. But do not celebrate just yet, because number 2 on our list is even harder to track down than anything we have covered so far. And one small overlooked detail has managed to turn a few dollar flea market find into a reel worth well over $600. And that brings us to number 2, because if you thought the reels we have covered so far were already rare, this next one exists on a completely different level entirely. And many dedicated collectors spend years actively searching for one in genuinely original condition, while other unsuspecting sellers unknowingly let theirs go for roughly the price of a quick fast food lunch. And that reel is the Hedden Model 315, a reel that spent decades sitting quietly in the shadow of Hedden's far more famous fishing lures. And because most people naturally associate the Hedden name with lures rather than reels, they very often overlook this particular hidden collectible without ever giving it a second thought. But that exact oversight is precisely why it has become so highly desirable among serious collectors today. And the Model 315 was only produced for a relatively short window of time, and its genuinely advanced level wind mechanism was considerably ahead of many competing reels being sold at the exact same time, and at one busy Pennsylvania flea market. One of these reels sat quietly inside a pile of completely ordinary reels, with a modest $6 price tag attached to it, and nearly every single shopper walked right past it without noticing anything unusual, until one experienced buyer happened to spot the small head stamp pressed into the side plate, and a quick, careful inspection revealed that the level wind bar still moved smoothly exactly as it should, confirming it was an early and genuinely complete example of the reel. And not long afterward, that very same reel sold for $640. So if you ever spot a hidden reel sitting somewhere unexpected, check the side plate first, and then carefully test the level wind mechanism without ever forcing it, because those two small details alone can make an enormous difference in the reel's final value. And do not go anywhere just yet, because number one on our list is honestly the biggest surprise of them all. A reel that almost everyone has personally seen at some point in their life, yet almost nobody realizes it can still be worth several $100s today. And that brings us to number one, and the reel that almost nobody expects to see sitting at the very top of this list, because it is not particularly flashy. It is genuinely not all that rare on paper, and for decades it was sold in ordinary sporting goods stores all across the entire country without much fanfare at all. And that widespread availability is exactly why thousands of people still mistake it for nothing more than just another ordinary old fishing reel taking up space in the garage. But here is the real secret behind its value. Finding a genuinely complete example today turns out to be far rarer than simply finding one at all. And that reel is the Shakespeare 1900 series, a reel that may have technically been mass-produced in enormous numbers. But most of the surviving examples out there today are missing important parts, have replacement pieces mixed in, or show clear signs of years of heavy, ongoing wear and tear. And that widespread condition problem is exactly what makes a genuinely untouched, complete example so valuable to collectors today. And during one particular barn cleanout taking place in Georgia, an entire crate of old fishing gear had already been loaded onto a truck headed straight for the scrapyard without much thought. But just before that truck pulled away for good, someone happened to notice a dusty Shakespeare 1900 series reel still sitting inside its original box, complete with the printed instruction manual and an extra spare spool tucked in alongside it. And what had looked like just another worthless old reel moments earlier ended up becoming a genuine collector's prize, eventually selling for $415. So if you ever happen to come across one of these reels yourself, do not judge it purely by the reel alone. Instead, look carefully for the original box, any surviving paperwork, and that spare spool, because those small extras can dramatically increase the reel's overall final value. And finally, test the drag system to make absolutely sure it still works smoothly the way it was originally designed to. So before you ever throw away another old fishing reel sitting forgotten in your garage, take one last careful look at it, because you might genuinely be holding several $100s in your hands without even realizing it. And now it is your turn to tell us which of these 10 reels surprised you the most. So let us know down in the comments below. And do not forget to subscribe for even more hidden treasures that could be sitting quietly in your own garage right now.